Welcome to this episode of The Entrepreneur's Gap, and this is episode 9 where we have Dan Levy being interviewed. The whole idea of the Entrepreneur Gap podcast is that we're looking for, one, the gains and pains of entrepreneurship, to understand that journey, but then equally to understand the gap in the market and how you can actually find a business that you can start. For anyone who doesn't know what business to start, or they're sat there thinking they would love to be an entrepreneur, but they just don't know really what direction to go in, Dan's message in this podcast is really a testament to there'll be something in your past, something that you've done before, maybe even from your childhood, that can eventually get you to the point where you scale a multi-million pound business all from that idea. And that's where Dan stemmed from. Here's the interview.
So I'm Dan Levy, originally from Glasgow, but I've ended up in Bristol, so a bit further south with a bit better weather. My business is Pitta, so we've got falafel, hummus, fresh salads, pita breads, obviously, and signature sauces, and we're producing them in central kitchen. And our model is that we sell directly to the public. So we've got 6 standalone stores throughout the southwest, so Bristol and Bath area.
Amazing. So to our listeners, that's a hugely established business. So first of all, we all know the catering industry, the hospitality industry is like one of the hardest markets to basically conquer. Whichever route you go down, whether it's a bar, a restaurant, whichever niche, it's a hard business to operate. Yes. And what our listeners are just going to hear is like, you've got this huge operation now, 6 venues, you've expanded massively, you do fresh food, straight to vendor, like straight to customers. Obviously it didn't start there. So why don't we take it like back to the beginning, before you open that first kitchen? Why did you choose entrepreneurship, first of all? What made you want to become a business owner?
I think I always wanted to do my own thing, just be in charge of my own destiny, really. I started off as a chef, so got quite a sort of long chefing background. I spent about 12, 13 years as a chef. And I think most people who see chefing as a career, I suppose there's 2 routes that you can go down eventually. One is to become a head chef of a very well-established restaurant, go down that route, or start your own business. And for me, I never wanted to go down route number 1. I always wanted to do my own thing, but I didn't really know. I was chefing for the majority of the time. I didn't really know exactly what that would be, how that would crystallize, but it was actually the 2008 crash that was the catalyst for me to go into what I'm doing now. So I was working in high-end restaurants, so kind of Michelin star, lots of kind of silverware, glasses, things that break, a very staff-heavy operation. Obviously, the crash of 2008 caused a lot of turmoil in that sector of the industry. So that was really when I saw the people that I was working for, the businesses that I was working for, really struggling to get customers, because obviously the price point was quite high. And that was something that made me think, if I can go into the other end of the market, the kind of bottom end of the market, so more kind of street food, very casual, like relatively cheap to produce, low price points, then that's probably where the market's going. So that crystallized in my head sort of 2008, 2009, and then opened the business in 2011.
And that really was that start of the street food era. Like that's really where we started to see all of those restaurants coming through. Yeah. So that's obviously the gap in the market was 2008 crash. Money all of a sudden wasn't as available to most people, but people still have that urge. It doesn't matter how much you earn, whether you're wealthy or whether you're sort of scraping the pennies together. The reality is we all like to treat ourselves. It's those things that make us feel special and good, and food is always a part of that. Okay, so that was the gap in the market that you saw. And I've got a couple of questions that sort of came off of what you just said. And the first is, how old were you when you started your business?
30.
30. Okay, so 30 years old.
I was actually 29. I was 20.
29. Okay, shaved a year off. How many years were you 29 for? That's the question. Because I remained 29 for many years. I'm probably about 62. Okay, so 29, started your business. And the reality is, when you start a business, most people don't know what they're doing. You've got a lot of skill sets that you've learned along the way. And this leads to my second question, because I come from a chefing background as well. So I grew up in a chefing family. My mum was a chef, my dad was a chef, and my brother became a chef. I became a chef, not to the levels that you're talking of Michelin star and smashing china and crystalware, but down that line. And I still believe to this day that chefing taught me some of the skills I use in entrepreneurship now, the ability to juggle problems, that sort of stuff. So do you feel the same? Like what did you take away from those 13 years in a busy a la carte Michelin star restaurant that you feel have transitioned you to be able to start your business?
I think in the kind of Michelin star scene, things are very organized and exacting. Things need to be done to a certain standard. You know, it is tough. It is really tough. It is definitely sort of school of hard knocks, and definitely a baptism of fire for me when I first went in. I'd say the biggest thing is that, you know, when you do something, it needs to be done properly and to a certain standard. And to do that, you need to have a clear head and be organized
Yeah.
in your own thoughts, write things down, prepare. So yeah, I think from that point of view, and I still use a lot of that stuff today. That's never going to go away. It's almost like going into the army, where you're kind of taught a certain way of doing things, and it's ingrained in you. Like, you know, you make your bed every morning, and you know, that stays with you for the rest of your life, and it's just a habit that you'll never get out of. So it's sort of similar from working in that kind of background, really.
I love that. I love that analogy of the army. You do it the same thing every day without fail. You get up, you make your bed, you polish your shoes, you get your uniform ready, you do that. You're completely right. When you first start in business, consistency does beat clever.
Yeah.
Always. If you can do the same thing day in, day out and it's working, you're always marching towards that next goal, that next milestone, that next sale, that next customer. So yeah, I love that.
I actually think that having that background and that training was something that gave me an advantage over other contemporaries in the industry who were concentrating on street food, because I think there was very few people at the time that were making that move from sort of high end to the complete other end of the market. So I that gave me a certain amount of confidence that I know that I can execute certainly the food part of the business to a higher standard than most of the people that I'm competing with. So that's really what gave me the confidence to start my own business, really, because I thought
Yeah, I love
I've
that.
got an advantage over a lot of these people. Not trying to blow my own trumpet or anything, but I was just confident in my own ability to be able to cook. The business side of things, didn't have a clue when I first started, you know, and learned trial and error along the way.
Yeah, I love that. And I think so there's two really poignant things there. First of all is if you have a skill set that you know you're better than anyone else at, that is your niche. That's the reality. If you can be so good they can't ignore you in that particular part, you'll absolutely smash it. Restaurants, knowing any food establishment, it only takes one or two bad experiences to ruin a reputation.
Mm-hmm.
So if you can deliver consistently in
Mm-hmm.
business, time and time again, you're going to get those repeat customers. You're going to get those 5-star reviews. You're going to have an unblemished reputation. And Michelin star is all about that.
Yeah.
Everything is on point. Everything where it needs to be.
Yeah.
So if you then take that to the street food industry, where most people are slapping something in a bun, throwing it out there, if it's not perfect, oh well, it's street food.
Yeah.
You're delivering to that high level.
Yeah.
But for a cheap price.
Yeah.
What they're basically getting is Rolls Royce for Renault Clio money, which that's perfect. Yeah, I love that. Okay, so that was your gap in the market.
Yeah. Another advantage was that the fact that I knew how to cook was obviously a massive advantage. I think a lot of entrepreneurs that go into the hospitality and restaurant scene maybe have the business experience, but don't necessarily have the cooking part down. So they're always being held hostage to the head chef. And they're only as good as the head chef, you know. So if the head chef leaves or if the cook leaves, then ultimately, you know, another chef's going to come in, and it's not going to be exactly the same. So it's that old analogy, like if you give 10 people the same recipe and ask them to cook something, you're going to get 10 different results. Cooking is just very like that. It's very difficult to have exactly the same result every time.
Yeah. And so how did you achieve that? Like, what was that? Because there must have been a part, I know we're going to go down the journey a little way now, but there must have been a part where you couldn't be in restaurant 1 and restaurant 2, or restaurant 1, 2 and 3 at the same time. So like, how did you blueprint that? Or even in restaurant 1, there'll be days where you took time off. How did you make sure that it was exact? Like, what was that defining moment where you thought, actually, this is how you replicate success time and time again?
Just systems and procedures, just taking what's in your head and putting it on paper. I do have quite a simple menu, but you can still mess it up if you don't follow all the steps. But essentially, it was just very simple, taking everything that you've got in your head and putting it on a piece of paper. And back in 2011, it was mostly pen and paper at that point. And when I had one restaurant, I was there every day. So the first location that I had was 6 days a week, closed on a Sunday. So I was there all the time, missing birthdays, missing, Christmas.
I mean, that must take its
New
toll.
Year's. It was pretty standard, to be honest with you, from what I'd done before. Chefing is kind of notoriously difficult industry in terms of the number of hours that you've got to do, and the pay is obviously not great, and sometimes the conditions are pretty tough as well, working in a hot, sweaty kitchen. So it was nothing new to me. It was completely natural.
And how much of your success do you think boils down to that missing birthdays, grinding, always being there? Do you think there was another way to do it, or do you think that was just a rite of passage? You had to go through that pain to get to the gain on the other side, where you don't have to work 6 days a week?
It's difficult to say. I mean, in hindsight, for example, if I was to start another business in the hospitality industry now, I would do it very differently. But you don't know what you don't know. So at the time, I made certain assumptions, and one of the biggest assumptions was I need to be there all the time. The exact opposite is true to a large degree to be able to run a successful business, in my opinion. So this is what I think now, is that you want to make yourself as inconsequential as possible to the business. So God forbid if you cross the street and get knocked over, that the business is going to run without you. So you don't want to make yourself central to the business, in my opinion. But in the early days,
Yeah.
I absolutely was central. I was, everything was passing through me. Well, I was essentially a one-man band. So if I wasn't there, it would have been difficult to run. But as time went on and I put those procedures and systems and people in place to make sure that I was not central to the business. And I think that has been absolutely key to the fact that it's allowed me to work on the business, not in the business, and to actually grow.
Yeah, I love that. I think as entrepreneurs, as people, we very much get stuck with the perceptions that we have at the time. So I write about this in a chapter of my book. It talks about challenging those perceptions, because you allow them to guide you for so long. And the longer you allow them to guide you for, the less you challenge them until you absolutely have to. And that's usually the thing that's standing in your way of progress. So as a good example, the you at the start of your journey versus the you now has two very different perceptions on business. The first is, I absolutely have to be there. It has to be me. Everything has to run through me. It's my level of quality. It's my skill set. Now you know that actually, if you're stuck in a kitchen cooking, the business isn't moving forward. It's missing a trick. It's not seeing the next trend curve. So they're two very different versions. And it all comes from challenging those perceptions. You're right. You would never know if the you back then could have changed things, because the reality is you'd be in a different place, but you don't know what it looks like. You have to appreciate the journey for what it is so far, and then learn from that to change the journey for tomorrow.
Yeah.
And I suppose a question that would come from this, and I always try to think of the questions that people might be thinking in their head while they're listening to this, which is, let's say you've got an entrepreneur out there, whether they have a business or not, they're in that entrepreneur mindset. They want to start a company, they want to move forward, but there's something holding them back. What advice would you give to them, having been through the mill in a business for a number of years, and you've been through the mill as well with the likes of COVID, which we'll come on to?
Yeah.
What advice would you give them now if it meant that they would take that first step?
I don't think there's ever a good or a bad time to start a business. I think you just need to bite the bullet and go for it, because if you're waiting for all the conditions to be perfect, you're probably going to be waiting a long, long time. I mean, when I started Pitta, that was 2011. So I actually started conceiving, having the concept 2010. And we were still right in the middle of all the sort of financial troubles that came off the 2008 crash. So, conditions were not ideal. A lot of businesses were going to the wall. I would encourage people to just crack on and do it, and certainly do not wait for conditions to become perfect, because they probably never will.
Yeah, agreed. I think as well, if you're able to have the courage, because it's just courage, that's plain and simple. It's courage to start the business. But if you have courage to start the business when no one else is, you've also got less competitors, less people wanting to, because the barrier to entry is a lot higher. So I would rather plant something where there's a few people trying to do it than go to an absolutely nourished, rich field, but there's millions of people planting the same
Yeah,
thing. Because the reality is, it's easier to fight challenges than it is to fight competitors.
yeah,
And if you're being drowned out by 50,000 other people doing the exact same thing as you, which is what social media is effectively, if you're trying to get seen on social media, you're doing the same thing that everybody else is doing, because that is, and there's no barrier to entry. You can set up an account today, shoot your first video, send it out into the stratosphere and see what
yeah,
happens. Whereas if you wanted to do something that no one else is doing because there's a cost barrier or a barrier of knowledge or a barrier of time or ability, the reality is it's easier to play in those markets, even though it's harder to get into them.
yeah.
So yeah, I think that's a really, really valid
Totally.
advice. So moving on, let's look at, so Dan has started his business. You've had that first year of sort of effort. You're now looking to scale. Well, actually, I suppose the question would be, you've found some success, you've launched your business, you're seeing some results. What was that first 1 to 2, maybe 3 year journey? What did that look like? You're obviously working loads. We know you're doing 6 days a week, but when did that success start to feel like it was actually going in the right direction? Was it instant, or did it
It
take some
was
time?
instant. It was the good old days. It was from day one. My biggest sort of hurdle to overcome was how to serve people quicker. So to improve sort of the operational side, and to be able to get.
What a lovely problem
Oh,
to
no,
have.
I don't have that problem anymore. Actually, no, I'm still working, obviously, on trying to increase the cap on how many customers we can serve in an hour. But yeah, that was the main problem at the beginning, and amazingly, I mean, this might seem quite archaic now, but it was all cash. I wasn't taking it. There was no card machine, so I didn't have a card machine for the first probably year. So I was taking cash, banking cash at the end of the day. I'd quite often get to the end of the day. I'd never seen so much cash in my life. 600 quid, 700 quid. I'd never held so much cash in my hand at the same time. So yeah, it was from that point of view, it was very exciting, because I don't believe that these kind of opportunities come around too often. You might have a couple in your lifetime where you hit on something that is just an absolute winner, and it was really from day one. I kind of got the impression that I'm onto something here, and that obviously gave me the confidence to reinvest and grow from there.
Yeah. And what did that growth look like? What was the, not the investment amount, but what was that first stage of growth? Was it bringing someone in to help you? Was it setting up another stall? Like, what was it, going from a gazebo on the street to your first venue? What was that step?
I actually first started at a street food market, and I actually went through the Prince's Trust. At that point, I did a young enterprise course. I don't know if it's still running at the moment, but obviously the stipulations were that you needed to be under 30 and unemployed for 6 months or more, which I was at the time. They put me with, or they gave me some support in terms of writing a business plan, and being put with a mentor. And one of the big things that they focused on was a kind of will it work. So it's actually getting out there with your idea onto the street, investing as little money as possible at the beginning, and just testing the idea out in the market. So I did around 3 months of working at a street stall every Saturday. So I'd start off at home, making my hummus on a sort of Thursday,
Mhm.
Friday, making my falafel, chopping all my salads, putting everything in my fridge in the back of the Ford Fiesta, and setting up a trellis table on a Saturday stall. So that was for 3 months, and again, had a really, really positive feedback from customers. We were nice and busy, so that gave me the confidence to actually get my first permanent location, which I've still got today, which is in a kind of almost like a sort of Camden
Mhm.
Market, open air, kind of permanent street food market, essentially. So that was the first step, and then from there,
Mhm.
one of the big challenges was convincing landlords to give me another location, to give me a lease, because obviously landlords want security, right? They want a strong covenant. They want to know that you've operated for a certain amount of time and you've got a certain amount of profit and that you're essentially good for the rent. They don't care about anything else. So they just want to know that you're good for the rent. So that was a big challenge when you're pitching yourself up against a bigger operator. So say like a Costa Coffee came along and wanted a location, and then you with your glorified street food stall want a location. Who's the landlord going to go for? Obviously they're not going to bat an eyelid. They're going to go for the established business. So that was probably one of the biggest challenges in the beginning, is actually convincing a landlord to take a chance on me. Luckily, I did manage to do that. But it was hard going. A lot of fish that got away.
I can imagine, yeah. And I think that thing of being given the opportunity. So you mentioned two things during that. One was, if you find something that's working, you need to grab it, because these come along like once in a lifetime, twice in a lifetime. So if you see the sparks of success, you've got to pour petrol on it to see if it's going to really catch, really go. And I think that's probably relevant for some of the people listening here. They've probably got a business idea in their head. It might be a passion project. It might be something they've stumbled across. And the reality is, and this is how we do our businesses as well, we start with a very low investment, very small amount of stock, very low risk, and low return, to be completely honest. Low risk, low return, but sometimes high return. But what you're looking for is, you're not looking to get rich, you're looking to prove a concept. You're looking to understand, does it work? Could this work? Could it be scalable? Could it be an opportunity? And that, I think, is very poignant with anyone who's looking to start a business. Figure out the cheapest way. And I've owned a catering business that we did exactly the same. We bought a gazebo, we went around street food markets, traveled the country, selling our wares and testing it until you go, well, do we turn this into a permanent location? So that's that first thing. And then I think once you've proved that concept, you then just have to fight, because you are a small fish in a big pond. But the reality is, you can grow quickly if you find the right people. So that landlord who's willing to take a risk. And sometimes that won't be exactly what you want. You might end up paying more. You might end up being in a location that's not the best one, but it's your first once round the track, twice round the track, getting that traction to then go to the next venue and say, well, we managed to do one here and make it profitable. Imagine what we could do in your location. So yeah, I love that as good advice as well to the people from your journey. Perfect. So next question then. Now that you've grown, now that you've got 6 locations, you're very well established, what does business look like for you? What are the gains that you've got from that journey, first of all, because it's a long journey? And what's been the main pains of that growth to where you are today?
I mean, where I am now is I've kind of got to a point where I've taken on quite a lot of central costs. So the central kitchen I've got is 80,000 square foot. I've got a sort of purpose-built production facility. I've got a lot of overhead in there. And that is a business model that is increasingly tough because it relies on a sort of critical mass of physical locations, income generating stores. The central kitchen does not generate income traditionally, although I've kind of tried to turn that into an advantage in that I can run corporate events, weddings, parties, sort of the event side of the business from the central kitchen. So actually just maximizing and squeezing more juice from the lemon. So I guess the sort of biggest challenge is that I need more stores to make the business model more viable. And that obviously is very capital intensive. It's very, burns up a lot of cash opening a new store. I mean, you're talking about anything from, depending on the size of the location, 100,000 to anywhere up to sort of 250,000. And that money needs to either be generated from sales and profit, or you need to borrow it, right? So I'd say that's probably the biggest stumbling block at the moment is actually generating enough capital to grow the portfolio. And the banks, the traditional banks, they just don't like hospitality at the moment. We've gone through all these problems with COVID and inflation, and people are spending less money and they're cutting back. So it's quite a tough environment at the moment. A lot of contemporaries in the industry that I talk to are all going through the same thing. So it's not something that is specific to Eat a Pizza to our business, everyone's going through the same thing at the moment. So I guess it's, being honest, it is tough. I think a lot of businesses that don't adapt are not going to survive. It's probably the most difficult trading conditions that I've
Yeah.
experienced to date. So yeah, I guess that's kind of where we are as a business. We're still trading strong, obviously, but overheads are increasing all the time, and customers are only prepared to pay a certain amount. So minimum wages going up, electricity is going up, food costs are going up. We're about to get hit with business rates, employers' national insurance. So all these things are coming at you, but then you kind of got no choice. You've got to raise your prices, right? But I think there's a certain point at which people will no longer kind of hold their nose and pay the money. So it's a difficult balancing act. It is tough, and therefore you're kind of building a moat around your business in a way, because it is very difficult to survive at the moment. So the ones that are able to adapt and survive are going to come out of this and do very well, I believe, because everything's cyclical, isn't it? The good times are going to come back at some point.
Yep.
It's just a matter of time.
I think that's a really poignant view on entrepreneurship, because a lot of people just focus on the gains. When people see these big businesses, this journey, everyone assumes it's roses at the end of the tunnel, but the reality is it's those peaks and troughs. It's the gains and the pains. And at the minute, you're in the depths of the pain, which is drawn out of COVID, and that's still a problem. Changes in government, new raises coming in, like they're taxing the business owners, taxing the businesses. They're trying to squeeze the juice out of your company for tax to try and save all of the money that they spent during COVID for vaccinations, for furlough, for all of those schemes that came through, which at the time helped us. Then now we're replacing that, but it's also because we're given a land of opportunity. The good old days where you could just make money and scale quickly, and you have to go through those pains and gains. I think that's really poignant, and it's actually refreshing to hear that raw honesty of where business gets to. And the reality is, as you scale, like you mentioned, you've got this big facility and it requires multiple locations, which require heavy capital investment. You are essentially, which every entrepreneur has to do when they go through growth, is crossing the desert. You only have enough water to survive a certain period of the journey. And it's all about strategically figuring out, well, where is that next pond where we can fill up? Where is that next place we can go to keep this journey going, until you get to that promised oasis at the end, which is then where you make hay while the sun shines. And then there's the next desert. Do we want to cross that and go from 6 locations to 24 locations? Do we want to go to other countries? Like, the journey never ends. So for an entrepreneur, it's not just build a business, sit and drink sangria on the beach.
Certainly not.
It's build a business, stabilize it, make sure your workers are happy, make sure you are where you need to be, and then cross the desert again. And it sounds like you're just in the middle of one of those deserts, but you're also being thrown curveballs by a new sun appearing, which might be a government that's about to tax you heavily. Another one that's beating down on you, which is the COVID, which came in and took away your ability to trade. So I think that's really refreshing. So thank you for your honesty in that. And sort of as we come towards the end of the podcast, like to finish on a high note, what I would say is there's people who are listening to this who don't know you. So I know you quite well now. We've been friends for some time. And you popped my falafel cherry not so long ago. I'd never had falafel before. So you were my first, and I'll always remember it. But what I'd say is, like, people listening, why falafel? What made you go down that route?
So it was actually my grandmother's recipe. So the falafel itself has got a history and a heritage behind it. It was a 3rd-generation family recipe that was passed down from my grandmother to me. So my family on my mother's side originally are from North Africa, in Algeria, moved to Morocco, and then eventually ended up in France. My mum never taught me French when I was younger. So I wasn't able to have a proper conversation with my grandma. So when I went over to Nice, so we'd go over for like 2 months every summer and spend time with that side of the family. And being unable to actually converse with somebody in their native language, you kind of manage to form connections in other ways. And my grandmother was a great cook, so I always had that very special connection with her, sitting on her countertop while she cooked up a storm, breakfast, lunch, and dinner. That's probably actually where my love for cooking came from originally, thinking about it. But the falafel, whenever she made it, it was just always a big hit. always had a really, really positive reaction from everyone. So when I made the decision to go into street food, I didn't even have to think about it. It was something that was always there, always had that recipe in the armory, and it was just an obvious one. Obviously, the advantage is that falafel and all the food we sell actually is vegetarian and vegan. It's not by design. People from that part of the world eat falafel because they're hard up and they're obviously like trying to get their protein in as a substitute for meat because there's not enough meat to go around. So it's kind of incidentally vegan and vegetarian. I am a vegan and vegetarian myself, and I've kind of ridden that wave as well. So that's is a kind of happy coincidence, really, in that back in 2011 when I started, there weren't really many sort of vegan or vegetarian restaurants, and obviously it's exploded in the past 12, 13 years. So that's obviously been a big advantage, although it still does represent, veganism does still represent a tiny portion of the population. So from a sort of commercial business point of view, it's something that we've lent on, but only to a certain degree, because I think you've still got the stigma of vegan food's not tasty. Vegan food is, quinoa and tofu, and it's not going to be absolutely delicious. But what we serve is super fresh, super tasty. Like absolute bags of flavor. I mean, that's what street food's all about. Tons and tons of flavor. It's healthy. It's fast.
Agreed.
It's fresh. So it hits all those key points.
Yeah, I love that. For anyone who's listening who hasn't tried Eat a Pitta, head online, find your local one. If you're ever in the area, if you're not near one of his restaurants, do go and try it, because honestly, the history, the romance, all of the things that just came out in that story that you just shared, you can sense in your food. Like, it is really high quality. It tastes amazing. And what I would say is, for anyone who's also sitting there thinking, well, what business am I going to start? Dan just literally shared with you that it's already there. It's in the vault somewhere. It comes from your childhood. It might be a passion that you found. It might be something of the similar ilk. It might be something really close to you, but you just don't realize that you can monetize it. You can share that with the world. And if you think about Dan's recipe, that's like third generation, hadn't been shared with the world. It was just something that was being used to keep the protein there, to help fight off the bad times. Like, that's where it came from. And what it's become is a business that's enjoyed and celebrated by loads of people. He's feeding thousands of people each week a recipe that he used to make with his grandma because he couldn't communicate well with her. But it was a way you could share passion and love in a family environment, which I just think is amazing. That's what business is about. People don't realize that although as you get into the weeds of a business, it becomes commercial, it becomes processes, it becomes wages, it becomes staffing, locations. The reality is you can boil it all back to sitting on that kitchen countertop, engaging with someone that you don't speak the same language to, because that's where your business began. It might not have been monetized, but really it is. That's where your business began. And I think to round this off, so firstly, thank you. This has been an amazing conversation. But to round it off so people leave with that last sort of shred of wisdom, that thing they can walk away with and take action themselves, the question I'm going to ask you is, what do you think it takes to become successful? What would you say that our listeners can draw from their own experience? What characteristics do you think they need to either implement or accentuate in their own personalities to become successful?
So a couple of things that I'd say. The first one is, following on from your last statement, is I would certainly encourage anyone who's starting their own business to do something that they are passionate about, that they love, because there are going to be hard times, and you need that enthusiasm and that passion to drive you through. So when times are tough, you need to sort of dip into the reserve that you've got and to not give up. I'd say the biggest trait that you need in entrepreneurship is perseverance. You're going to get knocked down time and time again, but if you can get back up and keep going, that is going to help you stand head and shoulders above the rest.
Yeah, I love that. Perseverance. Yeah, I'd agree. I'd completely agree. And if you've got passion, if you do something that comes from passion, you will have the ability to stand up through your own grit. If you start a business that you're not initially passionate about, just become passionate about its success, because you're right. There's going to be times where you get knocked down. There's going to be times where everything's stacked against you. But if you can stand up and keep fighting, you're already better than everyone else, because most people get knocked out in round 1. If you're in round 7 and you're still standing, the likelihood is you're going to make it to round 100.
Yeah.
So yeah, Dan, thank you so much for joining us. It's been absolutely amazing. Cheers, buddy.
Pleasure. Thanks, Chris.